Music means the world to me. I don't think I've gone more than a day without listening to music since I was probably a young child. I love talking about it, I love making these videos, and I love sharing my thoughts with you. As I start putting out more and more content on this channel, I thought it would be a good idea to use this video as an introduction of sorts as to what my music taste is like. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through 8 albums that define my music taste. As a little bit of background, in my younger years, it was hip-hop, it was metal, and not much else. Those are still my 2 favorite genres and the genres I have the most experience with. However, since my college years, I really have expanded my tastes, and now I'm one of those stereotypical people who listens to a little bit of everything. I could have listed 50 albums here. The video would have been way too long. It was hard enough to trim this down to 8, but somehow I managed it. I'm going to go over these in no particular order. Just keep in mind that all of these albums are very special to me. First up, Paranoid by Black Sabbath. This is Black Sabbath's second album from 1970, and it was basically my gateway into heavy music. Around this time, I was discovering a lot of other hard rock bands like Led Zeppelin. I was listening to a lot of Jimi Hendrix, but Paranoid was always a record that rose above the rest for me. For an album that was so groundbreaking, it was also relatively simple and accessible, and for a 16-year-old kid, this was the perfect combination. Add in the fact that the lyrics dealt with dark subject matter like war, death, drugs, and insanity, and this only added to the formula that helped satisfy an edgy teenager. In my opinion, other than the instrumental Rat Salad, there is not a song on here that's not legendary. War Pigs and Paranoid have to be the best 1-2 punch to open any rock or metal album, and then the band slow things down with the psychedelic Planet Caravan, and you have Iron Man, which was probably the coolest thing imaginable as a high school kid. Electric Funeral doubled down on that energy. Hand of Doom takes a political term mentioning Vietnam, and Fairies Wear Boots is a hard rock masterpiece and the perfect way to close out a compact 8-track 42-minute masterpiece. While this album's title track went a little bit mainstream, most of this album was too dark for regular airplay. The guitar work from Tony Iommi was just maybe a little bit heavier than what Led Zeppelin and Hendrix were doing at the time, but it was Ozzy Osbourne's ominous lyrics that made this album as dark as it was. This would end up influencing bands like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, who came in and helped define metal, which would go on to be a genre that sees tens of thousands of bands emerge in the decades to come. And while there's no one defining moment that signaled the birth of heavy metal, Black Sabbath's Paranoid was a watershed moment that was one of the most important in the creation of the genre. Next up is The Infamous by Mobb Deep. We all have records that change our lives, records that we can split our lives into a time before we knew the record and after we knew the record. Well, this is that album for me. And to this day, it remains my favorite album of all time. And while this is one of the most raw, graphic, and hopeless albums from a lyrical standpoint, it's the production from Havoc that really caught my attention when I first discovered this at the age of 13. There are many great hip-hop producers out there, but I think Havoc's work on The Infamous alone cements him in hip-hop history as one of the greatest of all time. Right off the bat, I'll go ahead and just say that Shook Ones Part 2 is my favorite song of all time, any genre, and there is just nothing like that beat. When I first heard that on the radio, I was instantly hooked by just how morose, menacing, and depressive it sounded. Now, I wasn't an unhappy kid. I did have anxiety issues, but I was a piano and a keyboard player for many years, so Havoc's dastardly, down-tuned, and chopped piano really struck a chord with me. Many people would make a case that Shook Ones Part 2 is indeed the best hip-hop song ever, but then you have other dark classics on this album alone, such as Survival of the Fittest, Eye for an Eye, QU Hectic, and Cradle to the Grave. At times, this album, it's got to be one of the darkest and most morose hip-hop records of all time from a musical and from a lyrical standpoint. What really makes this album so celebrated is that it actually had sonic diversity. This was brought by Q-Tip from A Tribe Called Quest, who worked closely with Havoc on a good part of the album and produced 3 songs: Give Up the Goods, Just Step, Temperatures Rising, and Drink Away the Pain. When you're listening to this album, right when you kind of get in like a 5-6 track stretch where things just seem so hopeless and dark, in comes a Q-Tip beat to brighten things up. That diversity, that juxtaposition, it really works. And again, for me, the production here is the main attraction, but lyrically, this is an unbelievably scathing performance from both Prodigy and Havoc. Prodigy low-key gives one of the darkest and most heartfelt lyrical performances ever. He suffered from sickle cell anemia and seemed to channel his pain into his lyrics. If you read his book, he talks about the physical pain that he experienced all throughout his life. While he was making observations about the harsh street life in Queensbridge, you could tell that he was also suffering on a personal level. He was poetic and graceful on the mic, but also held back absolutely nothing and had no filter. That really goes a long way for me when it came to mid-90s East Coast hip-hop. The guest appearances on the album as a whole are stellar. You have Q-Tip, Nas, Raekwon, Ghostface, and Big Noid, a member of Mobb Deep's Inner Circle. This is a dark noir rap masterpiece. Truly one of the darkest, most hopeless, most violent records over some of the most haunting and yet most thoughtfully crafted beats in hip-hop history. And while hearing such a depressing and shocking soundscape may not be everybody's cup of tea, let's remember that Prodigy Prodigy and Havoc were merely acting as inner city journalists here, reporting what they saw, telling their story, and making the world aware of what was going on in their neighborhood. Some of the best art comes from pain, suffering, and despair, and that's exactly what Mobb Deep delivers on The Infamous. Next is The Black Saint and the Sinner Lady by Charles Mingus. Jazz is a genre that took me until early adulthood to truly appreciate, but once I got going with it, I never looked back. Miles Davis' Kind of Blue and John Coltrane's Blue Train were my gateway albums for jazz, and while they're still fantastic listens today, they don't get my attention anymore quite like The Black Saint and the Sinner Lady. Now, last year I decided to do a little project and hunt down 100 jazz albums that get the most critical acclaim and listen to them all. I heard a lot of stuff from Pharoah Sanders to Eric Dolphy to Thelonious Monk to Art Blakey, Herbie Hancock, Nina Simone, even Frank Zappa. I'll tell you that nothing struck me the way that this masterpiece from Mingus does. This album is about as moody as a jazz record can get. It's loud, it's commanding, aggressive, and full of tempo changes, but also features smoother, calmer parts. Mingus was apparently known for having a hot temper, and the music kind of reflects this. The music is exciting, it's cinematic, and some of those horns sound dirty and sleazy and make you feel like you're in some illegal Prohibition-era speakeasy at 1 a.m. It's really got a ton of personality. If there's one criticism I have about jazz in general, it's that it can really run together, but there's virtually none of that on this album. In the grand scheme of things, there were bigger jazz records from artists that were probably more impactful than Mingus, though Mingus did really command a great deal of respect and acclaim. This is jazz music for those who want to get into some of the further reaches of the genre, though I think in recent years this thing has really gotten its flowers as one of the best jazz albums of all time, rightfully so. Up next, we have Moving Pictures by Rush. Now, I know that Rush tends to get criticism for being cheesy or over the top, but this doesn't bother me one bit when it comes to what I think is their best album. I didn't get into Rush until college, as I was preoccupied in my adolescent and teen years with heavier things. But as that teenage angst kind of wore off, I began to get more patient with my metal and more open-minded to harder rock, especially stuff that was more progressive. While 2112 was the first Rush album that I ever bought, I soon got a copy of Moving Pictures and realized that the album was truly special. Everyone knows the big songs here, as Tom Sawyer, YYZ, and Limelight lead the way. However, what makes this album so special to me is the songs that weren't marquee singles, that are just as strong. Red Barchetta is a perfect song, The Camera Eye is just fantastic, and Witch Hunt and Vital Signs give this album a strong conclusion. In the context of Rush's career, it makes sense that they'd peak at this time in the early 80s. Earlier in their career, they stuck to generic hard rock, which wasn't bad, but it wasn't particularly unique. 2112 was their breakout record, which led to 3 more strong albums before Moving Pictures came out in 1981. Rush was of their own breed. During a time where punk reigned supreme and then quickly gave way to post-punk, new wave, and gothic rock, Rush perfected the formula that only they knew how to do best. They doubled down on what gave them such a good reputation in the second half of the 70s, and they perfected their craft on Moving Pictures. Next is Maps by Billy Woods and Kenny Segal. This album is just over a year old at the time of filming, so for an album to be around for such a short period of time and to make this list means it's really, really good in my eyes. Arm & Hammer is one of my favorite hip-hop acts out there right now, and while Billy Woods and Elucid complement each other very well within Arm & Hammer, Billy Woods as a solo artist is pretty much just as good. He's been on this tear in recent years where he does an entire record with a specific producer, which is becoming a pretty big trend in hip-hop these days. He's done albums with Messiah Music and Preservation here in the 2020s alone, but I think his best solo work comes with Kenny Segal. The duo released Hiding Places in 2019, which is Billy Woods' second best solo album in my opinion, and the record that stands above it is this thing. On Maps, Kenny Segal gives Billy Woods unpretentious, relatively calm, and atmospheric instrumentals to rhyme over. The atmosphere is perfect for Woods' introspective, straightforward, candid, and many times relatable subject matter. He's hip-hop's everyman, and he doesn't put on any sort of persona or play any role. He's kind of a regular guy who just happens to communicate it using his incredible poetic talent, which he's pretty much perfected on this album. Maps is filled with some of the best songs of Billy Woods' extensive catalog, such as Soft Landing, Babylon by Bus, NYC Tapwater, and the astounding FaceTime. There are a few guest appearances. There are some bigger names if you're a fan of modern or underground hip-hop. You have Danny Brown, Quelle Chris, A$AP Rock, Shrapnel, and even Arm & Hammer's Elucid show up on this project. To be fully transparent, this is my favorite album of the 2020s so far. Billy Woods and his style are a perfect fit for my tastes, and Kenny Segal's production style is something that I really get into every time I hear this. Maps is a modern hip-hop masterpiece. Dirt by Alice in Chains is probably my favorite rock album in existence. I've always had a soft spot for grunge. There's a ton of nostalgia from my early childhood. I remember hearing Alice in Chains, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden on the local radio stations growing up in the Philadelphia area. So perhaps nostalgia is partially driving this placement, though I was too young to really know of any of Alice in Chains' songs until they broke up in the mid-90s. 90s, but I can still hear Lane Staley's voice all these years later wailing over those staticky airwaves. It was only a few years later that I developed a proper relationship with Alice in Chains. Being a metalhead but also appreciating grunge, it was a perfect fit for me. At first I spent a lot of time with their debut Facelift, but as time went on, Dirt quickly became my favorite. This album has everything you could want as a grunge appreciating metalhead in my case. Slow, plodding songs and heavy riffs with some of the most powerful vocals I have ever heard. Dirt's lyrical content touches on drugs, suffering, and loneliness, but also brings sort of an upbeat energy in places that gives this album great sonic diversity. Them Bones is a great example. Jerry Cantrell cooks up one of the greatest riffs of the 90s, and he and frontman Lane Staley wail over it in a way that just makes me happy. The album is filled with classics like the upbeat Damn That River, the majestic Rooster, and the absolutely heart-wrenching Down in a Hole. Junkhead, Sick Man, and Godsmack address Lane Staley's heroin habit directly. This is all done over incredibly heavy riffing from Cantrell and a commanding rhythm section from bassist Mike Starr and drummer Sean Kinney. And just when you think you've been through the ringer enough, the band turns up their best song of all time on the final track, Wood, which should be as popular and well known as Smells Like Teen Spirit in my opinion. The pain of Lane Staley is on full display here. He had debilitating drug problems by around this time and was a full-blown functioning heroin addict. Unfortunately, his habits would cause the band to break up later in the 90s, and while they reunited here and there, they would never exist the way they did in the early 90s, and sadly, Lane's habits caught up with him, and he died of an overdose in 2002. Dirt is a rock masterpiece. It transcends grunge, and it melts your face while dragging you down and beating your emotions up. It makes you realize once you're done listening that maybe your life isn't so bad after all, what with these guys making music this dark and honest. At the same time, it holds just enough mainstream appeal to give it a wider reach. This album has really gotten its flowers in recent years, and I really hope it continues to do so. Brave Murder Day by Katatonia. That's an album that probably not too many of you have heard, but this one's pretty important to me. Relatively early in my metal discovery years, I got pretty heavy into doom metal, specifically death doom metal, which combines slow riffing with harsh, screamed vocals. Sweden's Katatonia was one of my first discoveries, and as it turns out, this was their second and final album for that style. For the rest of their career, they'd go on to be a depressive and gothic rock band, but they'd do a damn good job at it, just for the record. But in 1996, lead singer Jonas Renski recruited his friend Michael Ackerfeld, who was in a new band by the name of Opeth. As the story goes, Renksi couldn't handle the harsh vocals anymore, so he recruited Ackerfeld to help out. Renksi and the rest of Katatonia had already put out a good deal of material, so they were in peak form by the time they wrote and recorded their second album, Brave Murder Day, with Ackerfeld. The result is one of the most celebrated albums of the genre. Katatonia guitarist Anders Nystrom and Fredrik Norman make simple, heavy, repetitive, melodic, doomy riffs sound fantastic, and the album is a little more upbeat than the group's 1993 debut Dance of December Souls. There are even elements of shoegaze here, which would go on to be present in Katatonia's later work. The opener, Brave, is a 10-minute epic where Ackerfeld puts all of his heart into his vocals. Murder, Rain Room, and 12 follow the same formula, and while the album sounds pretty depressing, the guitar work is actually kind of energetic and it's very melodic. The band slows things down and Renksi returns to sing the song Day with clean vocals, which is a beautiful mid-album break from the wall of sound that surrounds it. Now to me, this album is as good as it gets for the death doom metal genre. Again, not a hugely popular album, and maybe one that you may or may not know, but if you're into heavy and somewhat depressing music, I highly recommend this. And last but not least, we have the Avalanches, Since I Left You. In the last 15 years or so, I've really developed an appreciation for electronic music, and along with albums like Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works 85 to 92 and Burial's Untrue, I learned to really appreciate the genre a lot with this album. As a hip-hop fan, I appreciate this album a bit more than most electronic albums, as it takes a heavy influence from hip-hop music and samples it throughout. The Avalanches are an Australian group that have released only 2 other albums. This was their debut record, and it came out during a time where artists like Daft Punk, Fatboy Slim, and Moby were bringing electronic and dance music to a widespread audience for perhaps the first time. When it comes to Since I Left You, it's just a wonderful combination of generic dance music, new disco, and plunderphonics, which is music that's heavily based on sampling, as well as psychedelia. This is a highly experimental album that is celebrated today for just how unique it is. The title track opens the album and is just about as sublime of a song that you will find. It's lush, beautifully sampled, extremely melodic, and warm. The album's track list, it is pretty long, but just about every other song gives off this hedonistic, summery vibe that I can't really remember hearing anywhere else. Other highlights are the energetic Flight Tonight, the wild Frontier Psychiatrist, the deep Close to You, and Live at Domino's, which is a late album stunner. This album is just so warm and inviting, and once it gets you in with the first couple of tracks, it brings some more aggressive hip-hop influences, which for me are a perfect touch. The sampling here is whimsical and psychedelic, and you'll actually hear a horse being sampled periodically throughout this album. It's just such a cool, unique record, and one that is an absolute keystone when it comes to electronic music. If you're still with me at this point in the video, I want to thank you for hearing me out. As I said, music is very important to me, and being able to share why these 8 albums are so special to me, that means a lot. Let me know in the comments what you guys liked, what you didn't like, and if you vibe with my taste or not.